Worker shortages, strikes, and supply chain disruptions. How is this affecting the U.S. economy, and can the infrastructure bill save the day? Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. U.S. President Joe Biden has staked his presidency on two key parts of his legislative agenda. The infrastructure bill, focused on rebuilding the country's infrastructure and creating jobs, and the reconciliation bill, which would fund social programs. However, both pieces of legislation are being held up by divisions among U.S. House Democrats. Meanwhile, the labor sector remains in flux, with 4.3 million people quitting their jobs in August, as many workers across the country have gone on strike for higher wages and better benefits. To discuss all of this and more, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Los Angeles, California, is William Lee. He is the chief economist at the Milken Institute. Here in Washington, D.C., the rest of our panel, Brian Becker is the executive director at the Answer Coalition. Adolfo Franco is an attorney and Republican strategist, and Joseph Williams is a senior news editor at U.S. News and World Report. Welcome to all of you. And Joseph Williams, let me start with you, and let's look at the labor situation right now. It looks like workers in the United States are beginning to flex their muscle. There have been 255 strikes so far this year. More than 100,000 people went on strike just this month, which has led to it being called Striketober. I mean, we've seen action at John Deere, the agricultural equipment manufacturer, nurses going on strike in New York, and also picketing at Kellogg. These are all big companies. What's going on? Have workers suddenly found that they have bargaining power?
Well, and let's not forget the averted strike in Hollywood, where the craft services people, the station masters and so forth, agreed to a contract to avoid a strike that seemed apparently imminent. And yes, I would agree that workers are finding that they're flexing their muscle, particularly coming out of the pandemic. We have a lot of jobs that are available, but not that many people who are all that eager to fill them. And I think I'd heard at last estimate there were 1.2 available jobs for every worker who is out on unemployment and who is not working right now. Workers are flexing their muscle, mostly because over the last decade, workers had to keep their jobs. I mean, the good news was you had a job. The bad news is you do whatever you had to do to keep it, mainly because you knew that you were replaceable. But now that the pandemic has shown up, workers are finding out that they don't necessarily have to take it anymore. They don't necessarily have to go work for low wages in poor conditions, especially when a pandemic risks that they might get a disease that could kill them. So in all of this, some economists are calling it a recalibration of the relationship between employers and workers, and others say that it's a recalibration that's long overdue.
William Lee, Joseph Williams was just telling us a moment ago there about the fact that people are not taking available jobs. To what extent has persistent labor shortages pushed up wages in the country?
The wage story actually is an interesting one, because most of the wage increases have taken place among the younger workers, new entrants to the workforce, the traditionally low-paid service sector workers, and essentially people at the junior levels of their careers. If you ask anybody who's in the midpoint of their career, managerial staff, people who've been around for a while, I think every one of them will tell you they're not expecting wage increases at all. In fact, they're expecting a lot of efficiencies to take place within companies, and they're expecting their wages to actually go down, or they'll be laid off. I think the restructuring of the labor force right now is that companies are looking for ways of lowering costs, because COVID has introduced a new element into the calculation. People are asked to do jobs that expose them to danger. And a lot of employers are just not willing to raise wages for many of these jobs. And if they're not willing to raise wages, what they are willing to do, though, is to try to find ways of employing new technology to replace workers with machines and robotics and technology.
William Lee, do you get the sense that something fundamental has changed in the relationship between employers and employees in the United States?
Absolutely. On the part of employees, I think these low-paid workers who've been laid off for months and months, who were given stimulus checks and were able to survive during the period of lockdown, have found that they increased their marketability by going out and improving their skill set. So that now what you used to have as a waiter is someone who's now going off to look at the entry-level jobs in the accounting firms or in the law firms as paralegals. So people are upgrading their skills. The other sea change that's happened is that businesses that are traditionally very bound to low-cost labor are discovering that there is a lot of technology out there that allows them to cut back on the use of these low-wage workers. The restaurants are a good example. Restaurants have traditionally depended on people to come and sit down at their tables and a large waiting staff to take orders and deliver food to them, are discovering that electronic delivery and electronic order taking cuts back on the need for these low-cost workers and cuts back on the number of people who will be exposed to COVID infection conditions. So that sea change, I think, is something that we have not recognized widely enough, but it's a great thing that to recognize that the U.S. economy is flexible enough to allow that to happen.
Brian Becker, let's look at one key vital sector, and that is the healthcare industry. There have been at least 30 strikes by healthcare workers this year. More than 500,000 healthcare workers quit their jobs in August, and this all is coming at a time when the country is still in the throes of the pandemic. What's your reading of what's going on?
Yeah, healthcare workers are fed up. I mean, a huge number of healthcare workers were actually laid off by private hospitals in the middle of COVID because they weren't able to make the same profit margins because elective surgeries, which are not really that elective, I mean, surgeries that are vitally needed, but there weren't ICU beds available, they started laying people off. So we had this weird situation where in the middle of the pandemic, a big part of the healthcare labor force was actually being laid off, at least in the private sector. Those in the public hospitals and the community hospitals are overwhelmed. Legitimately overwhelmed by patient care, by the fact that there's been multiple waves of COVID, that 1 out of every 4 or 1 out of every 5 deaths in the world from COVID happen in the United States, have happened in the United States. I mean, the numbers are off the charts. So it's exhausting, it's demoralizing, the pay is not that good in many of the places. And then you have auxiliary kinds of work too. There's another important statistic here. There are 126,000 fewer childcare workers than there were 18 months ago. People who left the jobs because the jobs paid $12 an hour to take care of a room full of kids during a pandemic, when you could go to Dunkin' Donuts perhaps and make $14 an hour. So when you look at those two things, people left their jobs. That means also a lot of primary caregivers, meaning largely mothers, many of whom are also single moms working in healthcare, don't have access to childcare, and childcare prices have gone so far up that childcare becomes unaffordable too. That's taken a big toll on the number of workers in the healthcare industry, especially among women.
Adolfo Franco, the labor market has certainly tightened. I mean, workers are making demands now that you wouldn't have thought they would have made just a few years ago. How do you think employers are going to respond to this?
Well, I think, before I respond to that question, I think one thing that has not been commented on by the other guests, and I believe it's a fundamental reason of why we're seeing this situation, is we're paying people to stay home. The unemployment benefits are incredible. I personally know somebody here in Washington, D.C. that's sitting at home making $60,000 a year. And many people, especially at the lower end jobs, just don't have to work. You either make pretty much the same amount of money or close to the same amount of money, or you can certainly do that and then some gig work at the side. So this has been a colossal mistake, in my opinion, to extend these benefits so generously. And of course, have been skewed around the country. As we know, it's very different to what you have to earn in Washington, D.C. than you do in Mississippi. This is what's caused this chaos. I really do not buy that people aren't seeking jobs, by and large, because they're scared of COVID. I certainly don't see that feeling in the society that I involved in throughout Washington and anywhere else, that people are doing all kinds of social things and they're demanding less mask mandates. They're doing all kinds of social and other activities. So I think that's been the chief component, in my opinion, of why we have the situation. We have a situation in this country where everywhere you go is now hiring. We are begging people to work, and people aren't coming to work because they don't have to work if they have the number of benefits. You dry up these benefits, and I think you're going to see the labor force very, very different in terms of people going back to work.
Right,
And I think
Rodolfo,
just
how do employers who are advertising these jobs, but these jobs are not being filled, of course, how do they respond to that? What do they do?
Well, this is the conundrum and the disaster, particularly for restaurant service industry and the lower end part of it.
Right.
There's just an economic reality here that as much as people talk about these wages they want to go to, I think at one point President Biden said, oh, just pay people more. Well, you can't make it in a small restaurant into business if you're paying people $25 or $30 an hour for the service industry. So it is a huge problem. It's the number one problem for employers. And again, I think it's been caused by bad policies that have incentivized people not to look for work, or certainly demanding wages that are going to destroy particularly small businesses.
Joseph Williams, what do you make of Adolfo's point that people are actually staying home because the benefits are so good? I mean, and is that sustainable?
Well, it's number one, not necessarily accurate. There have been studies that have proven that states that took the step of ending the benefits, ending the additional benefits that the federal government provided for unemployment, the states that ended those benefits early saw a lower number of people returning to the workforce than states that had the benefits sustained over a longer period of time. The state that I live in, Maryland, being one of them. So I don't know that it's necessarily correlated to the fact that the benefits have been extended longer. But you also have to recognize the fact that over the course of time, since the late 80s, benefits, or rather wages for workers, have remained largely static. The workers that are receiving pages, hourly workers, we are struggling to get the minimum wage up past $7 an hour. $15 an hour is supposedly where we're going to land, but even that doesn't necessarily cover the bills in a place like Washington. Yeah. So I think that it's not necessary that's a one-to-one correlation. I do think workers are trying to find meaning in work, trying to find work they want to work with. They're trying to find work that will allow them to actually live and not just merely exist.
Right. One other point, Joseph. There appears to be support now for labor being organized in the White House. Recently, the Vice President, Kamala Harris, she said federal workers should now organize, especially new workers. Let's listen to some of what she had to say.
So one, we, as it relates to new hires, have decided and are committed to making sure that they will be told at the time of being hired if they are eligible to join a union. They will be given contact information, and they will be informed of their rights. The second is, as it relates to current workers, we're going to ensure that all current workers are reminded that they are eligible to join a union.
So, Joseph, is this something new?
It's nothing new. It's basically enforcing the laws that already are on the books. But over the course of the last 5 or 6 administrations, labor law has been chipped away at steadily, and it's become a fact of life that labor is no longer a major player in American industry. You look at from the late 1980s, give or take, the union representation rate for the workforce was roughly 15–20%, and now it's below 5% for private industry. So I think what they're trying to do is encourage more organization. I know certainly in my profession there have been many papers and news outlets that are unionizing, that are trying to organize as we speak. So I think it's basically they're trying to create a friendlier environment by looking and reminding people of laws that already exist on the books about organizing and protection for workers if they want to start a union at their particular place of business.
William Lee, I mean, we hear that wages have not gone up, that people have not gone back to work after the pandemic. But if we look at the other side of this, Wall Street's doing really well, and there seems to be a lot of disposable income because consumer spending is still going up and up.
Yeah, well.
The big concern actually on Wall Street is that the cost increases are going to be eating into profits. And so far, there's been little evidence of that, you're right. But I think one of the things that has prevented profit margins from being squeezed is, I said earlier, the rapid application of new technologies to try to make each worker more productive. I think one of the things that we forget is that while it's important that to allow workers to organize, it's important to allow workers to express and clarify what it is that they contribute to the making of various products and providing various services. But one thing that is for sure is that the employer will go out of business if they're asked to pay costs that don't cover their income. And I think one of the things that companies have done is to try to make use of as much technology as possible to be able to make each worker more productive. The last thing any company wants to do is to lose a good worker, because that good worker takes time to train. And I think one of the things that we also forget is that organized labor is allowed to exist in almost every sector, every company, and it's given, and each company's worker is given a choice. Do you want a union or you don't want a union? Some companies, absolutely, they're demanding unions because they feel they don't have a fair fight with employers who seem to be one-sided. Other companies, Tesla, Elon Musk is famous for saying, hey, do you want some stock options? I can let you share in the profits of this company. Or do you really need to have a union represent you? So I think it's really a case-by-case basis where the importance of organized labor comes in. But to your question, companies on Wall Street are enjoying higher profits because those companies are able to use technology. The companies that are not, you find that their share prices are actually declining, and it's not a uniform picture across the board. Many companies are having profits misses because they're not able to adapt to new circumstances.
Brian, what do you think? I mean, is there a lot of resistance among employers to workers organizing themselves? And we also know that in some states in the country, there is legislation, so-called right-to-work legislation, which actually discourages union membership.
Yeah, it's called right to work for less in the labor movement, because it makes the closed shop, the ability of workers to have a closed shop, meaning that everyone's covered by collective bargaining and everyone has to pay dues. It makes it illegal. So all of the southern states, the former Confederate states, are right-to-work states that's migrated to the north. It's been devastating for the labor movement. I've been in labor. I've been a worker organizer. I've been in numerous industries. I can tell you that this has been an uphill slog for the labor movement. The reason the number of workers who are organized in labor has diminished so dramatically is because of an anti-labor offensive by management, because of the offshoring of jobs. So as soon as you unionize a place, they say, well, we're going to close it down and move to another country where we can pay workers a lower wage. Or the National Labor Relations Board, since the Clinton administration, not simply with the Republicans, has made it very difficult in terms of the way electioneering on the job has taken place. So workers are intimidated, they're threatened by management. The management uses all kinds of union busting tricks. They bring in big law firms that manipulate and intimidate workers. That's the reason workers who are generally sympathetic to forming a union are afraid, because they don't want to lose their jobs. And so this is an unfair playing field. And the only reason the labor movement has diminished is because Wall Street bankers and the big anti-union law firms have teamed up, largely with Republicans, but some Democratic administrations, to push labor back. And that's the reality of the situation. Wages, by the way, are actually going down, because if inflation is 5% or 10% when it comes to basic commodities like food or to housing, that means if you don't have a commensurate 5 or 10% wage increase, you actually have a pay cut. And that's the reality for a lot of workers around the country. They may have a few pennies more. By the way, the federal minimum wage now is lower than it was in 1968 when Dr. King had the Poor People's Campaign. It's 40% lower in real dollars than it was in 1968. This is an anti-labor offensive by the U.S. government in concert with Wall Street banks and anti-union law firms working in conjunction with each other.
All right, Adolfo,
I just want to make one quick point, is that you also need to factor into that whole equation that we've had a number of Supreme Court decisions that have really diminished the power of labor. We've had a couple over the last 3 or 4 years where it's made it all but impossible to organize in the workplace, while at the same time workers are getting the benefit of the doubt when it comes to union organizing and not having to pay union dues, if a union still exists, to bargain for higher wages.
Okay, Adolfo, I want to move on now to the ongoing battles in Congress. There was an effort earlier this week by Democrats to pass voting rights legislation. This was in response to piecemeal legislation that has been passed around the country in mainly Republican states. But this effort at a federal level was blocked by Republicans. To pass a law like that would require a supermajority of 60 votes in the 100-seat U.S. Senate. So now President Biden is open to abolishing that supermajority requirement. It's known more commonly, of course, as the filibuster. Let's listen to what the president had to say. He was speaking at a CNN town hall. Let's listen.
That remains to be seen, exactly what that means in terms of fundamentally altering it, whether or not we just end the filibuster straight up.
When it comes to voting rights, just so I'm clear, though, you would entertain the notion of doing away with the filibuster on that one issue? Is that correct?
And maybe more.
So, Adolfo, do you think the Democrats would get rid of the filibuster?
Well, I wish next time we'll play Joe Biden's tape from July 21 at a town hall where he said he would not change the filibuster under any circumstances. This is just the 21st of July, despite his career of being a big proponent, a use of the filibuster, and a defender of it. So, but to answer your question directly, I think what the Democrat agenda here is to chip away at the filibuster. I don't think the filibuster is going to be completely eliminated. Obviously, it has been modified in the past with respect to, for example, judicial appointments and things of that kind, and even the Supreme Court. Now, you just need a simple majority, which was not the case in the past. So I think there will be the carve-outs that they're talking about. They will come up with some rationalization. And I'm saying about the Democrat Party will come up with some rationalization to chip away at the filibuster. I think they're trying to tee it up politically to say, look, there's just a roadblock here, and this is too important for the country from their perspective, and then limit its scope. I would be very surprised if there is a move to eliminate the filibuster, and all you have to look as the president's own words, President Biden's own words of 60 days ago, where he described ending the filibuster in toto would be a divisive and very politically unwise thing to do. That was just 60 days ago. So I think to answer your question, I think certain exceptions, and they will come up with a rationale that it will be modified in some cases, including on things related to, example, voting rights.
Brian, let's just put the filibuster aside for a moment and look at the fact that this was an effort to reform voting legislation, to entrench voting rights, and it was blocked.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, you know, when you think about it, the majority of the population was barred from voting until 1920. That was, you know, 140 plus years after the U.S. Constitution was adopted. Women couldn't vote. Black people couldn't vote. Huge parts of the population were barred from voting. Black people really, in the majority, weren't able to vote until 1965. And then the political equations, that was with the passage of the Voting Rights Act, because the southern states used all kinds of tricks to bar black voters from voting. Now you can see Trump lost the election by a large margin in the popular vote, 7 million, but he narrowly lost the electoral vote in some key states. In those key states, it was the black voter turnout that made the difference. So now the Republicans are kind of going back to the old historical playbook of trying to disenfranchise some voters, especially black voters who they think will be voting Democratic, and they're using all kinds of tricks. And the fact that the U.S. Congress, which is, you know, got a Democratic majority in the Senate, in the House, and a Democratic president, and they didn't really invest any capital in the voting rights bill, I mean, that's something terrible. That's something that is designed to contract, not expand democracy. And here you have the U.S. government telling all the rest of the world about how wonderful democracy is. And at the same time, the priorities of the big political parties, or at least one of them with very muted reaction from the other, is to limit or to take away voting rights, the basic, what was considered the core of political democracy. Really something.
But I have to interject here because you asked me to proceed to a question quickly. What voting rights are being taken away? Where? Here's what. Let me just make my case.
Like old Jim
Crow
politics.
You have plenty of airtime.
Old Jim Crow politics.
Let me make my case here.
Okay, Brian, just a moment. Adolfo, go ahead.
Yes. The number thing is, under our Constitution, the states set the rules for the management of elections. Yeah. This bill is in itself unconstitutional. There is nothing in the legislations in states like Texas and Georgia that are prohibiting anybody from voting.
All right.
Jim Crow is segregation of races. It has nothing to do with it as a canard.
Okay.
The laws that
Adolfo, hold on a minute. Hold on a minute, Adolfo.
And
Brian.
Texas are the same laws that apply today in Delaware, where Joe Biden has been a senator for 40 years and defended those laws.
All right,
there
Adolfo,
is nothing in the laws
Adolfo, I'm running out of time.
American
I need Brian to get in there. Brian, go ahead.
It's just an outright misrepresentation.
Go ahead, Brian.
Anybody who's paying attention knows that the Republican Party considers it vital to the possibility of Republican successes in the future to limit voter turnout. That's why we're eliminating voter turnout, voting on Sundays. That's why we're eliminating drop-off ballots. That's why we're eliminating early voting in many areas. All of these, and why we have ID laws, which of course will make it harder for poor people to vote. There's only one reason this is happening. The Republicans don't want a certain number, especially of black people, to vote in America.
Okay, I want to go to William Lee. William Lee, let's talk about the reconciliation bill, which is going through Congress right now. A lot of negotiations around this bill. What is your feeling? Do you think it will pass? I mean, do you think a meaningful bill will pass, or will it be watered down to the point where it's not really effective?
There's without a doubt reconciliation will pass. The real question is, what's the number behind the reconciliation bill and what will be its composition and how will it be financed? Those are the key questions. And because the financing is going to be on the back of corporate taxes primarily, because Joe Biden has promised no one with incomes below $40,000 will have any tax increase, the expectation is that the bill would be paid for by companies and by people who have high incomes. And the key to reconciliation is to get a level of expenditures that can be financed by those taxes. And I think right now with Joe Manchin holding the line, it sounds like the number is going to come down to about 2-point-something billion. And I think that even AOC has said that that does not mean we're diminishing the scope in which we're going to be helping people, but we're going to scale back on the number of years to which we are financing this bill, and we'll have to vote on this stuff yet again sooner rather than later. So the expansion of entitlements is one thing that bill has almost guaranteed, and the trouble is, if you expand entitlements, that means you have to have a permanent way of financing those entitlements, and that's a permanently higher level of taxation.
Okay, that's where we're going to have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.